Hi, my name is Jim Brule. I'm a transformational storyteller, and I'm really pleased that you've decided to take a few minutes and see what you can learn about telling more compelling stories. In particular, how we can use the narrative arc to guide the way that we tell a story, and what that has to do with our biology, with our neuroscience. The two are really tremendously intertwined. If you like what you see, there'll be an opportunity at the end of this presentation to find your way to visit the full lesson for free. And all it will cost is another moment of your time to hear about my program that's a complete program in transformational storytelling. But there'll be very little advertising in this little clip. So let's get started. The first question is, really, what is a transformational story? If we're going to be a transformational storyteller, what does it mean to have a transformational story? And basically, a transformational story invites the audience and the teller to meaningful change. Now, that's not the same as preaching to tell you what you should be doing. No, it's an invitation to some kind of personal, meaningful change that it turns out even the storyteller in the moment of doing the transformational storytelling invites upon themselves. Transformational stories can be the basis for healing the rifts between us and within us. Now, in order to be a transformational story, it can't just be any story, and it may not be the right story for the right time. And it has to be for the right people. So a transformational story is one that's selected carefully by the storyteller to be the right story for the right time for the right people. And even more importantly, it has to be told skillfully with an open heart. And the open heart is key. We can't invite change into others until we invite change and vulnerability into ourselves. Now, if you were taking the full lesson at this point, here's what we would be covering. Why we tell stories. How do we change and learn? Because if we're going to talk about transformation, we better understand how we change, and not just change from being hot to cold, but make some kind of real substantial change, how we learn and grow. You'll also learn about why stories are effective and how we can make our stories not just more compelling, but more transformational. And at this point, in the full session, I'd be telling you a story. It's killing me not to tell you stories now, but I really want to keep this short. We'd also go over this one part that we're really not covering today, which is change and learning. How do we grow? And that's all based on work that was done by Gregory Bateson. So again, part of what you'll get out of the full lesson. But now let's dive into the heart of it. What is this thing called the narrative arc anyway? And how does it teach us to tell better stories? Well, you may have heard of it, and you may have even seen this diagram, which looks like a mountain. You know, you have a person who starts off on a quest. And a lot of times these stories are broken down into various types of things like the hero's quest, but they all follow this basic arc. They start low in the left, time moves from left to right, and the anxiety or the energy in the story moves up and down. So in this presumed story where we've got some protagonist, we start the story at a low point of energy. But what's key is what's going to drive them, what's going to pull them actually from left to right, up and down those peaks and valleys. And that's going to be some object of desire. And this yearning, what in fact the Kabbalists tell us was the whole reason that the universe was created, is key. Without the yearning, there's not really much of a story. And that yearning, that object of their desire, can't be immediately at hand. There's no yearning if it's available. It has to be at some distance. So this is the fundamental basis of a good story, is that there's a protagonist, there's an object of their desire, and that object of their desire is at some distance from who they are. There are challenges between where they are now and where they want to be. So with my tremendous animation skills, we can imagine how this quest starts. The protagonist moves up towards the first real peak, the first real challenge. They encounter an obstacle, and there's some battle. There's some overthrowing of that obstacle, some surpassing of the challenge, and they move on. And they move through a series of these until they get to the ultimate obstacle. They have their ultimate challenge. That challenge is overcome. They're united with their object of desire, and the energy goes down. And we have a story. It seems pretty simple, but you'll realize as you start to apply this to whatever stories you might be telling, if you don't have these points clear, who the protagonist is, what's the point of view, what's really of interest to them, what are they yearning for, what challenges do they face, and how does that ebb and flow over time, your stories won't be as powerful as they might be. Now, it just so happens that we're wired for this, literally wired for this in our bodies. There's a lot of good work in neuroscience to make the case for this. So I'm going to give you a really quick view, a snapshot into a little bit of neuroscience just to make this clear. Now, you've probably heard of neurons, and you might know that a neuron is this long nerve that sits in your brain and elsewhere in your body, and it has two ends. One is the nucleus, and the other is a bunch of axons, and it's along these long axons that signals travel. Signals travel in the form of electrochemical energy. Again, we don't have to worry too much about that. And they're received at the next neuron along the dendrites, which you can see here. Now, it turns out that where that transaction takes place, where the signal goes from one neuron to the next, that's where all the magic happens, or a lot of it anyways. So what we're going to do is we're going to zoom in on this notion of the synapse, where that action takes place, because we're going to learn about some fancy kinds of chemicals that live there and color our experience. So this synapse, this little space between the axon on the left and the dendrite on the right, from the sending neuron to the receiving neuron, there's this little gap. And at the end of the axon, there are all these little vesicles, all these little bubbles that are filled with different kinds of chemicals. They're called neurotransmitters. And at the right time, in the right way, those neurotransmitters will be released into that synaptic gap. And depending upon which neurotransmitters are released, you'll get different flavors of the signal. And we'll see exactly what this means in a moment. Now, signals don't just travel down one neuron at a time. They kind of flood through our brain and our bodies. They race through our muscles and our guts. They're flowing all over the place, but the neurotransmitters give a flavor to them. Now, some of these you've heard of. We're only going to talk about a small number of them. And I'm going to break them down into basically two categories. There are neurotransmitters that make us feel good, and there's neurotransmitters that make us feel lousy. They make us feel full of stress. And you've heard of some of these in other contexts. We're going to be looking at them specifically in the notion of storytelling. So you might know, for example, that dopamine has some characteristics that have nothing to do with storytelling. Oxytocin is released during labor and delivery. Endorphins are released during exercise. This is all true, but we're going to be looking at them as they function within storytelling. So let's take a quick look at each one. Dopamine first. Dopamine is something that allows our minds to focus. When we've got a lot of dopamine in the midst of an experience, we stay much more focused on what's going on. We're motivated. We're kind of drawn towards whatever it is that stimulus is talking about, and it gives us access to our memories. It helps us not only build but retrieve memories, which are really important when we come to storytelling. How do we get dopamine in the sense of a story? Well, we get it from suspense, from cliffhangers. Dopamine really is the neurotransmitter that's associated with gambling addictions. It turns out we get more pleasure from the anticipation, from the suspense, from the cliffhanger of is this bet going to succeed than we do from winning. So people who have a challenge here really are getting flooded with dopamine that keeps them looking for the next maybe, not the next I won. That's dopamine. Oxytocin is the neurotransmitter. Again, as I mentioned, it's associated with labor and delivery, but it generates bonding. It generates generosity. It generates trust. You can see why it's important when you're delivering a child, but it's also important at other times. There's been some great experiments that show that if you put $10 in single bills in front of a subject and ask them to give some to a person sitting across to them, if they take a little nasal inhaler of oxytocin, they'll give more money to the other person. It builds that kind of generosity and trust. How do we stimulate that in a story? We stimulate it by empathic associations with whatever the character is or the situation is. So if I can describe a situation that makes you feel really close to the character or the event, then that oxytocin is going to start to really flow, and you're going to generate even more bonding and generosity and trust. And that's important in a story. Finally, of the three feel-good ones, we have endorphins. Now, endorphins generate creativity, they generate laughter, they generate focus, much like the first does, and they're really just a tremendous experience when you have a flood of endorphins. You're very, very creative. You're almost certainly laughing or about to laugh. I've got some endorphins going right now. How do we get those stimulated? Well, we stimulate them in a story by way of humor. So a little laugh, a little unexpected twist of a pleasant sort will generate lots of endorphins. Now, remember I mentioned there's two that make us feel stressful. I've put them together because in storytelling, they're almost always released simultaneously, and this is cortisol and adrenaline. Now, these two rather, their effects, and their first and most important effect is that they generate a flashbulb memory. Now, you've all got some kind of flashbulb memory. Most of them are not necessarily pleasant, but some of them are. It might be some really bad news that you heard. Do you remember where you were on 9/11? That sort of thing. When you met your first love and it really connected with you. Those are flashbulb memories. And they're not dry memories. They're not, oh, I was in this place or I did that. It's the whole context is retrieved for you. What you were feeling, what you were smelling, what you were tasting, it all comes back in this huge package. Well, that is a flashbulb memory, and that's formed when you have a lot of cortisol in your system. Now, if you take too much cortisol, it impairs your ability to make new memories. And in fact, as you're in the middle of a cortisol rush, an adrenaline rush, you can't form new memories. You can't retrieve memories of the past very well. All your energy is devoted towards making this new memory, this really incredible memory for use later on. Other effects are anxiety and fear. Because we've shut down so much of our ability to retrieve other memories and do other things, our bodies say this is a dangerous space to be in. So it generates a lot of anxiety and fear, and we try and get past those moments quickly. Now, how does that happen in a story? How do we get that to happen in a story? We get that by an unexpected contextual shift. All right. This is something that is key to every good story, that unexpected surprise. Okay. So out of these, we can make a perfect cocktail. And I'm going to show you these here. You'll be able to review them later. But as we move through that narrative arc, we're going to mix up different neurotransmitters to be released as we move through the story. And that's going to provoke the most powerful capacity for transformational change that we can hope for. So let's see how that works. Here's our narrative arc. You'll remember it. Now, if you've ever taken any kind of public speaking, they tell you always start with a joke. And if you look to the far left hand of this curve, you see the energy is up just a little bit. That's not just an artistic swirl. we're going to start our stories by getting people to be focused and feeling creative with this. We want them to unlock the possibilities of what might happen. So we tell a joke. We start with something funny as part of the story, and that gets the endorphins released, and that allows us then to start to focus and feel creative as the story proceeds. But then we take the energy down a notch, and we describe the protagonist. What are we doing when we're describing the protagonist? We're trying to make the protagonist somebody that we want to associate with. In some stories, it's something we don't want to have anything with, but we need the point of view of who either is we're identifying with or what we're afraid of. So that bonding, that trust, we want to build that, and we do that through the release of oxytocin. So we'll make an empathic connection with the protagonist, and then we'll start up the first challenge. And during that challenge, as we're trying to move towards that object of our desire, we're getting lots of dopamine going. We're getting anticipation going. When we do that, we're increasing the focus of the listener. We're making them more motivated. They're tied more and more to our story. We're priming memory. We're getting the brain ready to say, hey, we're going to make a new memory here. Get ready, get ready. And then we have that unexpected contextual shift, and pow, a flashbulb memory. And as we overcome that first obstacle, that's what the person remembers. It's the reader or the listener, whoever's receiving the story will remember that peak more than what happens before it. And we're going to repeat that a number of times, as many times as necessary through the course of the story, until we finally get to our big challenge. We get that big denouement that follows the achieving of that final object of our desire. And we end at another low energy space with more oxytocin, with more empathy. You're feeling, yes, I made it through this just like the hero of the story did. So, were you in the full program? I tell you another story right now, give you an example, let you find your way through it, see all those emotions and neurotransmitters being released. Then we talk about how one has to understand the terrain of a story in order to tell it well, how to tell it from different perspectives. But that's for our later program, our more complete program. Now here's that quick ad I told you about. It's about my Transformational Storytelling School. What you need to know about the school is that it's a 2-year program. It consists of 20 lessons a year, divided into 2 10-term semesters, and each of the 4 semesters has a different focus. It's not based on any one particular faith tradition or spiritual approach, but it is a spiritual endeavor. The first term, the 4 terms run in sequence. One term focuses on storytelling and how does one do good storytelling, what are the components of that. The second one has to do with multi-faith traditions. I have over a dozen faculty in different traditions, students who come from every imaginable things, Cherokee, Druids, you name it, Christians, Jews, Muslims, they've all been part of my program. From there, we move on to a deeper spirituality and how do stories affect us spiritually. And finally, because of my background and because of a special opportunity that Jewish students have in the program, we do some Jewish foundations. Now, each of these 4 topics is covered throughout the 4 semesters, but each of the 4 semesters focuses on one more than the other. If you think this might be intriguing, you should know that the next term begins on January 28th. So be in touch. So a quick look at some of the faculty that I've got. They visit us a couple each term, and we have some wonderful discussions with the class. And then here are the 4 sets of topics that we have, things that we study each semester. Each semester is followed by a retreat at a place that's convenient to the student body. The rest of it is all online. So if you'd like more information, here's where you can go. The full class you can get at that first link up there, bit.ly.transformintro, and that will That'll give you the full version of this class. Again, no obligation. Just click on it. It's yours. If you want more information about the school, transformationalstorytelling.org. And finally, if got some questions, you'd like to reach out to me directly, it's Jim Brule at transformationalstorytelling.org. So thank you very much for your time, your attention, your interest, and I hope you'll join us next semester. Bye-bye.